Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at an older video from the What Would You Say channel. In it, they explain what you should say when someone says that there's no evidence for God, in their typical one question, three potential answers fashion, except it's only two answers for this one. So let's see what we should say to that.
In a conversation about faith with a skeptic, they may say, "I can't make myself believe something if there's no evidence. And there's no evidence God exists."
Maybe this is just meaningless quibbling, but words matter, and I try to be careful with the words that I choose to use. I don't think you can really make yourself believe something. You are either convinced of something, or you are not. And I tried to make myself believe in God, but at the end of the day, I was just convinced that God did not exist, despite my efforts to ignore the fact that I was convinced. And also, there's the fact that if you make yourself believe in something, that's literally called make-believe. Generally, we can all agree that things that are make-believe are not real.
What would you say? Evidence comes in different forms. Imagine you returned home from a night out to find the kitchen garbage turned over, trash strewn about, and your shoes chewed up. Meanwhile, your dog is sleeping quietly in the other room. There are some things you know and some things you don't know. Unfortunately, you never set up your surveillance camera, so you don't have any direct evidence.
Do you need direct evidence for something like this? Yeah, I guess it's possible that someone other than the dog is responsible, but that is the most plausible explanation.
But everything you see suggests that your dog misbehaved before falling asleep. Is it possible that your neighbor came over and messed up your house? Yes. But unless you have an unusual neighbor, it's not going to be the best explanation.
And there you've added another piece of information that can change the conclusion. Does your neighbor have a history of behaving this way? Well, then maybe that is the best explanation, especially if the dog has no history of causing such trouble.
Now, if we look for the best explanation for the world we live in, here's what we find. First, God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe.
No, God really isn't the best explanation. The most simplistic explanation, sure, but not the best. And notice that I said simplistic, not simple. Some apologists are fond of using Occam's razor to point to God, saying that God did it is a simpler explanation than any of the cosmological models that we have, therefore it is more likely. But Occam's razor is not about how simple it is to state an explanation, it's about how many assumptions are being made to get you to that explanation. The problem with God did it as an explanation is that it carries with it all the same assumptions as the scientific explanation, and then adds multiple assumptions on top of that. So we still have all the science of Big Bang cosmology, but we add onto this the assumption that a God exists, that this God has the ability to fiddle about with the fundamental aspects of the universe. Usually apologists are fond of making assumptions about this God's motivation and character, etc. So, pretty much by definition, God as an explanation will always fail Occam's razor. It's just harder to see when we're looking at aspects of science that aren't well understood at this time. When God was the explanation for lightning, we didn't have a scientific explanation for lightning, and so to point to lightning and say that's proof of God would have seemed perfectly reasonable to apologists existing in a time before lightning was scientifically understood. But now that we have the explanation, nobody points to lightning as proof of God. At best, you'll get an attempt at, wow, thunderstorms are big, powerful, and cool. Makes you think of God, don't it? My point is, as science advances, the aspects of nature that are used as proof of God keep shrinking, almost like the natural world doesn't really point to the existence of God.
In the past, it was believed that the universe was eternal. But today, theists and atheists alike agree that there was a beginning when matter, energy, space, and time came into being.
Well, not quite. We agree that our local instantiation of the universe, and space-time with it, appears to have begun just before the Big Bang. But at this time, it is uncertain what was really going on there. And because this is a hard question, the answer to which will almost certainly run counter to our natural intuitions, apologists like to pretend that the Big Bang actually is the beginning, and then act as though this is some sort of gotcha. The universe began, so it needed a god to make it begin. Never mind the fact that Georges Lemaitre, the priest who developed the Big Bang Theory, and whose name I went over the top in my mispronunciation because I figured that I was going to say it wrong anyway, so I may as well go big, opposed the idea that the Big Bang proves God, saying, as far as I can see, such a theory remains entirely outside any metaphysical or religious question. It leaves the materialist free to deny any transcendental being. For the believer, it removes any attempt at familiarity with God. Now, why would a devout Catholic priest who was so scientifically rigorous that he was able to develop such a robust and groundbreaking theory of the origin of the universe say that this theory leaves the materialist free to deny any transcendental being if his theory actually proved the existence of this transcendental being?
Denying a creator, atheists are required to believe that everything we see came out of nothing.
No, we really aren't. We don't know what it all came out of. It's possible that, yes, it did come out of nothing. That is certainly one hypothesis. But it's also possible that the question of what came before the Big Bang is nonsensical, as time began at the Big Bang, so to ask what came before time began is just a nonsensical question, effectively rendering the universe eternal without it being an infinite regress. It is eternal in the sense that as long as time has existed, so has the universe. There are literally dozens of models of how the universe could have come into being. Popping in from nothing is one such model.
Experience and science tell us that something can't come from nothing.
That is absolutely not true. How has experience taught us that something cannot come from nothing? Have you ever studied nothing? Have scientists ever been able to isolate nothing and so be able to run experiments on it that would confirm or falsify this hypothesis? No, this is not something that science or experience has taught us. This is something that is assumed based on intuition.
We have never seen it happen.
Right, we haven't. But we've also never seen it not happen. Because we've never seen nothing. Period. How can we make assumptions about how nothing would behave if we've never been able to examine it? Well, to do that, we'd need to engage in mathematical modeling, and the universe from nothing hypothesis basically ends up at nothing being an unstable state, and as a result of this instability, universes would spontaneously develop where the sum total of the energy of these universes is zero, thereby not breaking any laws of thermodynamics in the process of creating a universe from nothing. And guess what? When we look at our universe, it appears that the sum total of the energy in the universe is actually zero. Now, it might not be, obviously we can't measure all of the energy in the entire universe, but that is what it appears to be when we calculate the energy based on what we can see.
But here we are. What's the best explanation? That something came from nothing? Or that something outside our universe caused the universe to exist?
Or that the existence of energy preceded the existence of time, rendering it functionally eternal without bumping into infinity. Or that the Big Bang is a recurring phenomenon, with each cycle resulting in a slightly different universe. Or that time didn't begin per se, but extends both forward and backward indefinitely, with the convergence points being the reversal of the process of entropy, which we perceive as the passage of time. Now, of course, when dealing with extremely complicated scientific topics like this, it is necessary to simplify, and listing them out like this runs the risk of oversimplifying to the point of error. But my point is that, in the field of cosmology, there isn't a question of who done it. There is only a question of how it was done. If we find out later that there is a who behind the how, then that will be incorporated into the models, but at this time, there is no such indication.
In any other context, we recognize that something can't come from nothing.
In any other context, we actually have never been able to study the kind of nothing that you're talking about, so whatever you say about it cannot possibly be known for certain.
We should in this context as well. A creator is the best explanation for the fact that the universe exists at all.
Nope, not the best explanation, just the most simplistic and infantile explanation.
Second, God is the best explanation for the fine-tuned universe.
Again, no, he's not. We don't have enough information to make such a determination. But also, we don't even know that the universe was fine-tuned in the first place. There are plenty of cosmological models that include multiple universes, either simultaneously, sequentially, or a combination of the two, all of which would have different tunings. In these models, the fact that we ended up developing in the universe in which it is possible for us to develop is entirely unremarkable.
Not only does the universe exist, but it contains a delicate balance of conditions that not only allow matter to exist, but life to be possible. From the strength of gravity, to the size of the moon, to the tilt of the Earth.
Blah blah blah, Puddle thinks the hole is specifically designed just for it, etc. Yeah, we know, but how do you know that it could have been any different? When push comes to shove here, this ends up being the same as the cosmological argument. We don't know all the details of some aspects of how the universe works, therefore God must be responsible. If you find that convincing, then good for you, I guess, but it's really not convincing to me.
Hundreds of conditions had to be just perfect at exactly the same time for life on Earth to be possible.
Only a handful of those hundreds of conditions are things like the fundamental constants, which would have had to have been the way they are in order for the whole universe to turn out the way it did. The rest of them are all pretty mundane, like the aforementioned tilt of the Earth's axis. Given the size of the universe and the number of stars and planets in it, it is completely unsurprising that a planet with Earth's characteristics exists. And it is even less surprising that life that is capable of living on an Earth-like planet developed on Earth, which happens to be an Earth-like planet. On top of that, a lot of these parameters are things that, should you change them, yeah, sure, we wouldn't be able to exist. But how do you know that some other form of life wouldn't be able to exist in those conditions? I've said it before, but in my opinion, this argument is actually an argument against God's existence. Because, of course, if there were no God, we'd exist where it is physically possible for us to exist. God miraculously sustaining us in conditions where life is impossible would be pretty good evidence in favor of a God, would it not? But no, we only get the wholly unremarkable fact that life as we know it happens to exist where it is possible for life as we know it to exist.
Now, what's the best explanation for this fine-tuned environment?
The best explanation is that any life that isn't adapted to life on Earth was unable to survive on Earth, and so the life on Earth developed which is capable of surviving on Earth.
No one looks at a watch and assumes it was created by an explosion at a watch factory.
Mainly because we know where watches come from. How many universes have you seen come into existence? None. We only have experiences with this one universe, and we haven't quite worked out where it came from yet. So how can we possibly just assume that we know with certainty that it was made by a god?
No one sees graffiti on a wall and assumes a paint truck was involved in an accident.
I suppose that depends on the quality of the graffiti. I've seen some pretty amazing art quality graffiti, but I've also seen graffiti that looks like a paint truck had an accident. But again, we are aware of the source of graffiti through experience. We have experiences that tell us that graffiti is caused by people. If we suddenly started finding evidence that pointed to a natural cause for the appearance of graffiti, we would start to change that view. But until such a time, we have no reason to believe that it is naturally occurring.
When we see evidence of design, we assume there was a designer.
No, when we see something that we have only ever seen come from a design process, then we assume there was a designer. The problem with this part of the argument is in describing exactly what the difference is between a designed object and a non-designed object, because in your view, the entire universe and everything in it is designed. So why do you need to use a watch as an analogy? If design is so self-evident, then shouldn't you be able to make the exact same point using, say, a snowflake?
Because logic and experience tell us that order doesn't come from disorder.
Does it not? Would you call the weather system on Earth orderly or disordered? It looks pretty disordered to me, and yet the beautiful symmetry and organization found in snowflakes happens because of this disordered system. Funny that.
Do coincidences happen?
Obviously. The only thing necessary for coincidences to happen is for multiple things to happen at the same time, or to coincide. Hey, coincide sounds an awful lot like coincidence. Coincidence? I think not.
Yes, but not hundreds or millions of them at exactly the same time.
Why not? Given the vast size of the universe, there are gazillions of coincidences happening right now. Somewhere, right now, as you watch this, there's a guy named James taking a dump. In fact, at least one of those people named James will be taking their dump as they watch this. James, I see you. Now, if you go down to the comment section and see someone named James commenting about how it was weird for them to have me describe their situation, is that a coincidence? Yes, of course it is, obviously.
If you want to believe God doesn't exist, you will find a reason.
Maybe, but in my experience, I actually wanted to believe that a God did exist, but I was unable to find a reason. And so here I am, explaining why I don't find your arguments convincing, meanwhile putting up with apologists constantly telling me that the reason I don't believe in God is because I don't want to. Sure, that's true now, I don't want to, but it was not true when I was in the process of deconverting. I was desperately looking for evidence that God was real, wanting to believe it, but pathetic arguments like this one left me, shall I say, uninspired.
You might also convince yourself that your neighbor, and not your dog, messed up your house.
Okay, but now we're talking about two completely different levels of evidence. We have experiences with neighbors and dogs. In fact, I actually have experiences with my neighbor messing up my house. When camping a few years ago, and while my mother was over to feed the cat, she caught him spray painting what he thought was the property line through our backyard, and when confronted, he was talking about demolishing part of our garage that he thought was on his property so that he could build a shed. Anyway, that's beside the point. Just for closure's sake, I'll tell you that eventually a proper survey was done, and it turns out that the property line is exactly where you would think it is just by looking at the layout of the property. But my point is, we have previous experiences with neighbors and dogs. We can judge which is more likely to have messed up the house based on these previous experiences. We can look for signs of forced entry, for instance, or missing items. Was something stolen and then the house made to look messed up to blame the dog and cover the thief's tracks? There is plenty of actual, real, tangible evidence that we can look for in this scenario. For God, you're asking me to agree with you on assertions about things that we don't even have a way to test at this point. These are not even close to analogous scenarios.
But that doesn't make it the best explanation for what you know.
Let's fix this analogy. I go out on vacation and come home to find that my backyard has been messed up. Spray paint everywhere, gate hanging open, etc. When confronted about it, the neighbor blames a dog. I don't have a dog. Nobody who has any business being in my backyard has a dog. I know of no dogs who spray paint mostly straight lines. But you want me to believe that because I didn't actually see my neighbor spray paint the yard with my own eyes, then obviously the dog is the better explanation, even though all the evidence we have thus far points to no dog having any involvement. In this scenario, it might even be that my neighbor is innocent, but that does not automatically indict the dog.
Let's review. Next time someone tells you there is no evidence for God, remember these two things. God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe.
Pure assertion with no evidence backing it up.
If God didn't make the universe, that means it made itself.
Nope, it absolutely does not. Using quirks of language to sneak intention into the beginning of the universe doesn't actually make it so.
And that doesn't make any sense.
Extra, extra, read all about it. When you phrase things in a way that makes no sense, it doesn't make any sense.
God is the best explanation for the fine-tuned universe. The universe is filled with intelligence, order, and evidence of design.
No, you infer design from analogies that rely on the inherent non-design that can be found in nature in order to prove that nothing in nature is without design. The argument trips over its own shoelaces before it can even get out of the starting gate. Yes, I know, starting gates aren't used for people racing. Shut up, James. I smelled your shit. You can't tell me what analogies to use.
In every other area, when we see design, we assume there was a designer.
And the only way we can just inherently see design is by comparison with things that are not designed. And if there exist things that are not designed, then there exist things for which there was no designer, which kinda takes the wind out of the whole God designed everything argument. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from the flagged YouTuber The Second, who says, "Your argument that God should appear to you is totally ego. You go to McDonald's and expect the president of the company to serve you fries and nuggets?" No, I don't, but there's also not a large group of people trying to convince me that if I don't have a personal relationship with the president of McDonald's, he'll burn me in hell. If such a proposition were made, I would expect that, at a minimum, the president would introduce himself to me first. That's kind of an important step in a relationship. So as long as apologists want to convince me that God loves me and wants a personal relationship with me, the most effective method for reaching that goal for him would be for God to introduce himself to me. Being omnipresent and omnipotent, it is literally impossible for that to even be a minor inconvenience to him. Now, if he would just keep his nose out of my business and not decide that he wants to torture me for all eternity when I die, then I'd be perfectly happy just going about life not expecting any god to pop in and say hi. But apparently he wants me to not touch my dick. I like touching my dick. It's fun. If that bothers him, that's a him problem. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jeffrey Dahmer, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, What Jesus, and all the rest. Who are the Jameses? Oh, you know what? I can't do it. I've called them cum before, but I'll be damned if I'll stoop so low as to call them James. Who are the best explanation for the existence of the universe that is my channel. If you'd like to actually be a really good explanation for the existence of my channel, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects like my podcast with my daughter can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Fucking James, man.